talking to me before, Tex and I have been talking quite a bit lately about the time that Disney lost his temper, and
Yes. Well, the thing is that, as I tell people, I shook hands with Grandma Moses. I howdied with Salvador Dali. I sat at Norman Rockwell's table, and I was yelled at by Walt Disney. And you know, how much more can you crowd to a life than that? I mean, that only scratches the surface.
it's all over with, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you.
But what happened is I was apprenticing to the story department, and I was assigned to a duck short called Daddy Duck, in which they were going to have Donald Duck and a baby kangaroo. And they already had the story worked out where Donald Duck gets a crate from Australia and there's a baby kangaroo in it. And Walt says, well, let's see what else we can do with it. And so we were trying various approaches. One was that Donald Duck is at a fair, and he has a prize cabbage, and the boxing kangaroo's baby kangaroo comes around and steals his cabbage. And then I came up with a concept where Donald Duck goes to Australia and gets involved with the kangaroo. This little kangaroo doesn't have a pouch, and he's trying to steal Donald's pouch. And I had a lot of slapstick stuff, and that was the approach I tried. And so we've been doing it about 2 or 3 weeks, and Disney and his usual entourage came in to check on how we were going. And of course, the custom was for everybody to tell his part of the storyboard, or tell the board he came up with. So I told him my part about this business with Donald Duck in Australia, and one of the guys in the crowd said, "But Tex, that's very funny stuff, but it's not our kind of stuff. It's more Schlesinger. And Schlesinger is the studio that became Warner Brothers." And I said, in front of Disney and God, we just like saying the same thing, I said, it wouldn't hurt us to get a little Schlesinger our stuff. Now, I think that, Bugs Bunny was beating us in the charts, and Disney was, I think they were bugging him about getting into more of the stuff that Warner was doing. And anyway, Walt sat there, and his collar goes up his face, right from right out of his collar, up his face, and then this vein stands out of his head and throbs, and he jumps up and he says, "God damn it," he says, "they'll make their pictures, we'll make ours." He stomped out of the room. And everybody moved away from me like I had leprosy. And they said, "What's the matter? Don't you like your job?" And since I really didn't belong to the story department, I was the animation department's baby, they shipped me back downstairs. They got rid of me quick. And I was usually a popular guy, but nobody came near me all day. I sat down in that room all by myself, and around 4 o'clock in the afternoon they began to drift in. Well, I found out later what happened, that there was a grapevine at Disney's, and finally he had come down the grapevine that after Walt cooled down, that he had found the whole incident rather amusing. In fact, he kind of liked my spunk. I don't think anybody had talked back to him in some time, and I think Walt got a kick out of it. But when everybody found out Walt wasn't mad at me, well, then they all came back, and there was quite a bit of studio politics at Disney. So if you got crossways to Walt, well, they waited to see what was going to happen to you.
There was a lot of nuttiness going on at the Disney studios, wasn't there? Wasn't something about Ward Kimball you mentioned before?
Well, Ward Kimball was was a master animator at Disney, but his room looked like the closet to a burlesque theater. He had all these costumes and so forth, and he also they played jazz. That was called the Hugger GD8. Later, it became the Firehouse Plus 2, and a lot of the top jazz people would come out at noon and they'd play jam sessions with him. But one day they were going to have some visitors in that wing, and so while the visitor in the hall, here comes a guy down the hall in a long overcoat, a derby hat, some false whiskers, and some goo-goo glasses, carrying 2 suitcases. Comes humping down the hall and disappears in the hall, goes into a room, and first thing you know, here comes a tall guy, looking just the same way, humping down the hall, and he disappears in the other end. And then pretty soon here comes a fat guy dressed the same way, goes humming back up the hall with these 2 suitcases, and here's Walt and the visitors watching these 2 guys go back and forth.
I guess he was just rolling his eyes, huh?
No, Walt understood these things, strangely enough, and it didn't particularly bother him. Sometimes he would kind of raised his eyebrow, but I think he kind of enjoyed the eccentricities of his staff. And then Kimball also, another time, Kimball had a portable closet which he pushed out in the hall and got into it and waited until he heard some visitors, and then he pushed open the door and rang a little bell and trotted barefooted into his room. But they were always doing these things at Disney's.
So has Ward been put away yet, or is he?
No, Ward's still alive. Ward's still going. He's the one that had the railroad, you know.
Oh yes.
But I'm trying to think that, and then one of his favorite stories is the one about Herman Twaits. Herman Twaits was an Englishman. He was in the background department, and Herman used to bring his lunch every day, and for dessert he'd have a tin of fruit salad. So one day the guys got hold of that can, and they steamed off the label and put the label on a can of pork and beans. So when he opened it, here were these pork and beans. He said, "By Jove," said, "Look, they made a mistake here." The pork and beans, and the guys came around, and they were all very concerned. Going, "Gee, what do you think about that?" Well, that was such a success. They steamed the label off the next day and put it on something else. And this went 3 days, and run out. Twaits is completely flabbergasted. He's just so excited. He says, "I just don't believe this." I said, "Well," and some of the guys said, "Well, you know what you ought to do? You ought to write Robert Ripley." and Twaits says, "By Jove, I believe I will." So the guys helped him write the letter, and one guy said, "Well, I'll take it down to the mailroom for you." So the next day,
that's a sure sign.
The next day they went over to the shop and had it opened the can and then had it soldered shut. And when Twaits opened the can that day at noon, there was a note in there saying, "I don't believe it," signed Robert Ripley.
I tell you,
but they had some very elaborate jokes going on all the time. There was one guy they were trying to decide how much electricity was generated by inking a cell, and they had wires running out the window down to a battery, and they were testing it. But they were always doing these things.
So let's go forward a little bit from Disney and talk a little bit about your famous studio days and maybe some.
Well, during the golden age of animation, the two major cartoon studios was Disney's on the West Coast and Fleischer's on the East Coast, and I worked for both of them. And by the time I got to New York, of course, Max Fleischer had lost the studio to Paramount, and they changed the name of the studio to Famous because Paramount owned the name Famous Players Lasky. And I was looking forward to working on Popeye. I always wanted to work on Popeye, but it turns out I was typecast as a cute animator, so I ended up working on Casper. And so I became a Casper animator. And I was telling the story about Mike Myers and Jack Mercer. Jack Mercer was the voice of Popeye, and they mostly did broad slapstick hurt type comedy. They did mostly Baby Huey and Popeye stories. And I worked next door. I worked both in the animation department and the story department there also. And I worked with a guy named Lars Bourne in the story. And I worked next door to him, and you'd hear Popeye and they're talking all day when they were working on a Popeye cartoon. So they decided that the front office decided they were going to give Mike and Jack a Casper to do, to try to see if they get anything fresh on it. And I tell you, see, I hated that little simp, that little ghost. He was always whining, "Nobody wants to be my friend. Will you be my friend?" Well, what Mike and Jack did to that little ghost filled every daydream I'd had, and that's the closest I ever came to death. Because I got looking at that storyboard and I got laughing so hard that I lost my breath, and I thought I'll never get it back. This is the end of it.